All right, guys, so a bit of a different one today. This is basically a podcast that I record for my clients privately, so it's only them that has access to it. And basically today, it's an episode all around stress and your allostatic load and how you should be able to understand and manage that. So I've recorded it for you guys as well today, so you can check it out, you can listen along and you can watch along, and then you can let me know what you think. But as always, if you enjoy this, then don't forget to like it, subscribe, smash those buttons. And I'll see you in the next video. All right, welcome back to another episode of the Aesthetic Athlete channel, guys. So today we're talking about understanding and managing your allostatic load, aka your stress bucket. The place that makes the most sense to start is defining what allostatic load is. So there's obviously technical definitions of, there's multiple different definitions of it, but for me, basically, it's the total amount of stress, in air quotes when I say stress there, the total amount of stress your body is carrying at one time, right? Now, your first thought when I say the word stress is probably just, psychological stress, things that are kind of, stressing you out in the kind of traditional sense, right? But what I'm talking about here is that, but it's also stress from training. It could be stress from eating in a deficit, in a surplus. So it's basically training. It could be financial stuff. It could be relationship or family stuff. It could be injuries. It could be illness. It could be work related. It's literally like all of your stress put together in one place. That is what we would define as your allostatic load at any one time. So AKA, what I like to call this, as I'm sure a lot of you know already, is your stress bucket, right? And I like to call it the stress bucket because it's kind of like all these stresses from different places, whether it's coming from financial, from work, from training, from injuries, they're all going into the same stress bucket. And that is your allostatic load. And if that gets too high or your bucket gets too full, then you end up, that's when you get anxious, you get overwhelmed, you're more prone to injury, your immune system's down, so you're more prone to getting ill. So what we want to do is be able to recognize when your allostatic load is too high, or even in advance recognize when it's likely to be high, so that we can actually adjust the factors that we can, mainly training and nutrition, accordingly. So that is pretty much your allostatic load. And what I want to go into now is more about how you can manage it. So hopefully now you have a better understanding as to what it actually is and how I think it makes sense to describe it as your stress bucket, because I just think that makes more sense, right? It's all going into the same metaphorical stress bucket inside of you, right? Because I think a lot of people will tell me that they de-stress or they relieve stress by training. And it's like, I get that, but at the same time, you're wrong in the nicest way possible, right? Because by training more, you are actually adding more stress to your body. Physical stress is getting added to your body. And yeah, okay, there's an argument in there for how intensely you are training. If you're just going in and doing some super light activity and even if you're just going for walks, like, okay, you're not exactly going to be adding, training stress in that way. But if you're going in and absolutely smashing yourself in the gym, then you are 100% going to be adding more stress to your body, even if it maybe feels like you're relieving psychological stress. So I think it's important to remember that when we are feeling particularly stressed out, you probably shouldn't be just fucking ending yourself in the gym and pushing yourself too hard. And actually, maybe it's actually a time where you just aim for maintenance in the gym and that could just be the 1 week where shit's hitting the fan, right? You decide to aim for more maintenance numbers in the gym. You're not as bothered about progression because you know that your allostatic load is high, right? So anyway, moving on, what I want to go into now is knowing what can kind of contribute to this and knowing what can reduce it. So I kind of think there's two parts to this, right? There's your stressors, which, as it sounds, is basically the things that typically make you feel stressed. And then your relievers, right? Which is kind of things that help you, de-stress, in air quotes there. So first of all, knowing your stressors. So like, what are they? You should know what your stressors are. Like if I asked you right now to pause this podcast in 10 seconds time and just make a list of all the things that stress you out. And it doesn't have to just be right now, the things that stress you out when they occur. Like you could sit and make a list pretty easily of probably 10 to 15 things that stress you out when they happen, even if they're not regular. And then the second thing you want to ask yourself is when are they likely to occur, right? Are they daily things that are happening quite often? Are they weekly? Are they monthly? Is it once a year that you get stressed out over these particular things? And then from there, can you actually predict them, right? So if you know what stresses you out, and you know when they're likely to occur, can you actually look forward and predict it? And then from there, if you can predict it, can you plan for it? And then if you can plan for it, can you control or at least minimize the impact it's going to have on you, right? So I'll give you a few examples here. So if we look at training, then so what's your stressor? Let's say this one is training. When is it likely to occur? Well, it's probably likely to occur a few times a week. It should be at least, right? Can you predict it? 100% you can predict it. Can you plan for it? 100%. Can you control and minimize its impact? Definitely. And this would be the perfect example of something is, I also I know I talk a lot about this specific analogy with you guys about the dimmer switch, right? So how a lot of people have an all or nothing approach to their fitness, right? So they have the light switch, which is either on or off. But what we want to do is take away that light switch and implement more of a dimmer switch. So there's times when we can turn it up and there's times when we can turn it down. Now, using your training as a way and reducing your training volume and or your training intensity when you know your allostatic load is going to be really high, maybe due to other factors, is actually is the perfect example of this, right? Because we can 100% control how much you're training and what your training intensity is. So we can definitely decide to either dial that down, or equally we can decide to dial that up, because actually we're recognizing that your allostatic load at that point in time is very, very low. So then we know you can actually handle a hell of a lot more, and we can afford then to turn the dimmer switch up and really push you forward and aim for maybe even higher intensity than normal. So this works both ways, not just when you're stressed out, it's also when you're feeling pretty good, and we know then, cool, your allostatic load is low, your stress bucket is not very full, so we have bandwidth to add more, right? Another example could be like work stress, right? Now, this one could be a bit of a mix, right? So you identify what it is. Let's say it's something like, every quarter end, is a bit nuts at work. So then when it's likely to occur. You can predict it happening because it's always kind of every quarter end gets a bit mad. So can you actually plan ahead for this? Can you now change other factors like your training, like your nutrition? Maybe even, looking at things like outside of that, like your sleep. Are you trying to make sure you're getting ample amounts of sleep during this time? Are you definitely, drinking enough water throughout the day at this time? Are you actually over consuming caffeine during this time, which is probably adding to potential feelings of overwhelmness and anxiety and things like that, because you're just overstimulated by so many things. So hopefully this has given you a picture as to how you can make this work for you. And then a final example could actually be like an illness, right? Which is something that, an illness is going to stress you out. You can't really predict when they're likely to occur. You could maybe plan for it to an extent, like if it's just like the kind of a common cold, you can maybe plan, okay, when I get a cold, I know I'm going to change these factors. But, if it's an illness or injury, obviously it's going to be unpredictable, and you're going to be limited as to how much you can control or how you can minimize the impact of that. So hopefully those 3 examples give you an idea of how you can actually implement this in real life. But what I want you guys to do off the back of this is do what I've just done, like write down the things that do tend to cause you stress in real life, and try and come up with an idea of, if you can figure out when they're likely to occur, how you can predict them, what you can do to plan for it, and then as a result of that, how you can control or minimize their impact, right? So moving on, the kind of second side of the coin here is knowing your relievers. Now, to make things simple, when it comes to your relievers, they are definitely just, the things that help you relax, or the things that help you de-stress, right? Now, it's important to emphasize, though, these won't always just cancel out your stressors, right? These won't cancel out the things that make you feel stressed. It's not like an opposite and equal reaction here, where you feel stressed from work and then all of a sudden you go for a walk and then you're not stressed from work anymore, right? That's not how it works. So these are just things that, for me, to be honest, I'll just use me as an example, because I think this part of it is very, individual. So for me, it's generally, and this is going to sound a little bit like hippie-ish, right? A little bit like woo-woo, but genuinely for me, it's more things that just bring me to what I'm doing in that moment. Because I often find when I get stressed is because I'm annoyed or frustrated about something that's happened that I'm not letting go in my own head, or I'm worrying about something that may or may not happen in the future. And actually, when I just do activities that make me just focus on what I'm doing there and then, that helps me, air quotes, de-stress, right? So anything that brings me back to the kind of present moment, that's why, I don't know why, I just feel like a hippie saying present moment. Bring yourself back to the present. So for me, that's genuinely things like walking the dog, movies, books, podcasts, and even just like seeing friends, but like specifically seeing friends and not being on my phone, just like actually being with friends and just like chilling out and just chatting away or doing whatever, but being in that moment, if that makes sense. So that's one part of relievers. I do think there's a second part to relievers here though, which is actually to do with tackling the stress a bit more head on. So that first part I've just gone through about kind of doing activities that bring you to the present and just make you focus on what you're doing now, so you're not thinking about the past, you're not thinking about the future, is the stuff that will never just cancel out your stress, right? Because if you're stressed about a particular thing, doing that is not going to cancel out your stress. But doing this next part might. So this is about breaking down tasks that are causing you stress, that are increasing your allostatic load, and putting a plan in place to actually tackle them as to how you're going to overcome them. And this just really helps me reduce like overwhelm around certain things. And to be honest, like organizing the training days is probably a perfect example of this. Like, don't get me wrong, like I love doing the training days, and I do generally enjoy organizing them, but there's a lot that goes into it from my end in terms of like logistical stuff, even, you know, finding out who can make it, finding a location for it in the first place, picking a date that I think most people a date and a time that, you know, should be available to at least the majority of you guys, planning workouts that's going to be suitable and adjustable for everyone who's going to be there, organizing all the kind of extra bits and pieces that I do on the day. Like, it doesn't always look like it might require that much, but in the background there's a lot that happens there. And it's one of those things that, like, you know, when I say, okay, I want to do a training day, and if I've set a date for it like I have for this next one, then it's kind of like, shit, like I need now to get everything done by that day, and I know I will, and I know it will be absolutely class. But it's kind of like, it obviously does, it's like any big project that you guys will have at your own work, right? It's like, you know you can do a good job, you know you can nail it, but it's going to cause you a little bit of stress. But for me, to reduce that stress is like, right, I just need to sit myself down and actually plan out from start to finish what I'm going to do. What's the day going to look like? Okay, now what do I need to do to organize that, etc., right? So those are the relievers for me that actually will tackle the stressors more head on and actually help you to de-stress with that particular thing that is causing you to be stressed in the first place. All right, so relievers there, you kind of have the two parts to them. Now, the last thing I'll speak about in this episode, guys, is how you can actually build your tolerance over time. You can increase your tolerance to your allostatic load. Like, you have the sort of the capacity for your allostatic load can improve over time, right? And you know, you should be able to handle higher levels of stress as we get older. And the perfect example of this is, like, you know, when you were like a 10-year-old kid and you got homework, like that would have stressed you out. Whereas now, when you're an adult, you know, you might have a mortgage, you've got a car, you may even have, you know, kids of your own, you got your job, you got your part, like so many things that can cause stress, but like they don't actually cause you that much stress, like relatively on a day-to-day basis. So it's kind of like, as we get older, we do increase our tolerance to stress. But the key thing here is making sure, like, if you're trying to increase your tolerance to stress, or you notice that your allostatic load is getting quite high, you notice that your stress bucket is getting quite full, you will need to reduce that somehow pretty quickly, yeah? Because it has to be gradual. And just in the same way that, like, when you're in the gym, you would try to gradually, progressively overload things. You wouldn't just go in and jump from, you know, if you're struggling to hit like bench press at 60 kilos one week, you're not going to go and try and hit 100 kilos the next week. So in that same regard, you need to understand that if you're trying to, you know, increase your tolerance to stress, you have to gradually let it increase. It has to be a steady increase, because too much at once is probably realistically speaking, if I'm just going to be honest here, is probably why a lot of you had actually failed in the past when it comes to some of this stuff, because you had that all or nothing attitude. Now, I know not all of you have, we've spoke about this, but a lot of you, especially when we very first spoke, like a common thing that comes up is the kind of all or nothing, like all in or all out attitude to fitness and health and nutrition. And often, like, that can only last so long, and it probably is that your stress bucket was too full, your allostatic load was way too high, and you end up either burning out or giving up or both, right? So, that is probably quite a strong reason as to why a lot of you people have failed in the past, because you've basically tried to take on too much at once. You've tried to spin too many plates, and ultimately they've crashed onto the floor, and then you've given up and you've gone all out again. So I think it's important to understand that you need to be gradual with this. And I think of this as like increasing your stress tolerance. I think of it's like you're building a bigger bucket. So coming back to the analogy of like using your stress bucket and all the stress is going into the same bucket, you're basically building a bigger bucket. And over time, that bucket, because it's bigger, can handle more stress. Because you're more dialed in, you've become more accustomed to certain levels of stress, and also you know how to handle higher levels of stress, right? So just to tie up that whole analogy there, you can build a bigger bucket, which means you're more tolerant to stress. The stress is let's just say the fluid going into the bucket, right? The relievers is like putting some taps on the outside of the bucket to let some of that fluid out. So you can have a constant flow of stress coming in, but if you're relieving it in the correct way, it can also come out. And then if you're building a bigger bucket, then obviously you can handle more volume overall. So hopefully that has helped you guys. If I was just going to do a little summary of some of the main points here, what I want to say is basically all stress goes into the same bucket, like the same metaphorical bucket, which is your allostatic load, okay? And if you let that get too high, so you let your stress bucket get too full, you'll burn out, or you'll give up, or you'll get ill, or you'll get injured, right? Those are the common things that happen to people when they get too stressed out. So what you need to do in order to, recognize, manage, or understand and then manage your levels of stress is identify what your stressors are and which of those you can predict and control, and then identify what your relievers are, being things that help you kind of feel more in the moment and don't worry about the past or worry about the future. But also the other side of relievers is things that actually help you put a plan in place to kind of head on tackle some of the things that are stressing you out. And then lastly, you want to build up the tolerance to stress over time by having that bigger bucket and never letting it overflow. All right, so anyway, that is this episode, guys. Hopefully you've enjoyed it. As always, do please put a post in the WhatsApp group of any key takeaways, anything that you've learned. If you've enjoyed it, it always encourages others to watch. But anyway, that's all from me, and we'll talk soon.